not one person has all the answers, I see. So we're all on this journey together, I think.
As you said at the beginning, there's no kind of one answer to this. It's kind of a learning process as you go, and you make decisions based on the best available data that you have. The city has been a commercial and financial hub for a long time, and I think that'll always be kind of its USP. But our members, I think post-pandemic, have, the big corporate strategy is around destination city, which is, I guess, trying to diversify the experience and the experiences people have in the city. That's whether you're a worker or a visitor or live in the city. So there's an evolving program around destination city, which tries to provide different kinds of experiences. That's not just kind of a program of events or happenings in the city. It's things like the Museum of London moving to the Smithfield Market. We've got the Migration Museum. That was approved a few weeks ago, so we've got cultural things like that happening. But it's much broader in terms of, it comes to our transport strategy and how we make the city an area of clean air, an area that's easy to move around. I think it's fairly sustainable already in terms of transport, in terms of the way people come in and out of the city, but we still want to reduce the kind of the traffic and the congestion in the city. It comes back to kind of our planning policy and how we create a vibrant and diversified offer in the city going forward. So that's kind of the overarching strategy for the corporation going forward. And I suppose just on hotels, I mean, over the last 10 years, we've seen a fairly significant increase in the number of hotels in the city. So I think it's gone up by 40%, the number of hotels over the last 10 years. 50% more kind of bed space in the city.
For those of you who don't know, the way the regulations have been designed, particularly this thing called the GHG protocol, which you'll hear quite a lot about today for those of you who don't know, essentially it means that companies have to report in their value chains, on their suppliers, okay? So the hotels that you own, operate, or will be building in Aled Square Mile, right, are part of his value chain. Okay, so they have to, if he's going to get to net zero, you have to help him get there in your operations. That's how this thing works. It works up and down these value chains. So that's why it's not really an option to go, you guys carry on, I'll just carry on over here doing my own thing.
The number one overarching theme in the global economy today is uncertainty. Everything can be as it looks until it's suddenly not. And it's not just that everything can go wrong, it's more that everything can change. If you look at what's happened in the global economy in the last 3, 4, 5 years, it's been about those big jumps, those big shocks. It's almost impossible for us to know what is happening with the global economy because all the data is so confusing. You have consumer spending that's either looking absolutely fantastic or it's looking absolutely terrible, very much depending on who you speak to. So if you look at retailers, you look at durable goods, everything looks like it's slowing down. But if you look at other parts of the economy, you look at, hopefully, the leisure and hospitality sector, that's where we're all choosing to spend all of our money. Because in the post-pandemic era, there's clearly been a shift that this is exactly what everyone wants to do with their time, with their money. A huge boom in certain parts of the economy, in particular in going out and having fun. It also gives us a world where, basically over the course of the next year, in aggregate, growth globally won't be fantastic. It will be largely flat, small percentage increases in growth on a quarter-to-quarter basis. And finally, the most important question is, will people keep spending? And that will drive all of these other things. It will drive the overall shape of the economy, it will drive inflation, it will drive where interest rates go. I'm skeptical that people will keep spending because if you were to say to an economist, I'm going to give you a world where interest rates have gone up 4% in a year, you look at a world where inflation is well above wage growth, you look at a world where things should theoretically be slowing down after a post-pandemic boom, you'd say, well, everything must be pretty weak, right? You must go into some sort of consumer recession. But we would have said that 9 months ago, 6 months ago, 3 months ago, and it hasn't quite happened. And so what we think will happen is you get this just continuation of spending, a rotation in spending. We'll all stop buying electronics and furniture and all of those things we stockpiled during the pandemic and continue to spend a little bit more on leisure, having fun, and Andrew Bailey probably won't like that.
I just want to read a quote that I saw from Bloomberg Intelligence. So apparently global ESG assets may surpass $41 trillion this year and $50 trillion by 2025, which is 1/3 of the projected total assets under management.
And what we do is that we only invest in investments that drive the economy towards net zero. And we really make dirty assets cleaner. So we like to use this catchy term saying is, we go where the emissions are. I think there is no trade-off between ESG or net zero, both of them, and getting the right financial returns in the medium term. For Scope 1 and 2 emissions are the emissions that directly relate to the company's activities. So Scope 1 is, for example, let's say I'm a capital goods company and I operate machinery and there's fume coming out of this. That's Scope 1. Scope 2 is anything relating to energy consumption. So oftentimes, companies find Scope 2 emissions reduction is the low-hanging fruit because they can, for example, plug into renewable power supply on a 100% basis via certificates, and they have decarbonized this. And then I think Scope 3 emissions is where people often get confused because they are outside of the company's activities. They basically refer to all the emissions that you can find across the value chain. So let's take a car manufacturer, because I think that's an easy example. Most car manufacturers both need steel as an input cost, so that would be the upstream Scope 3 emissions. But then for a car manufacturer, the real headache is the downstream Scope 3 emissions, which is the emissions the car generates once it hits the motorway. So for any car company you will look at, 90% of the emissions are actually Scope 3 downstream. And lastly, let's talk about the accounting framework. I think in the next few years, all big companies will have what I would call a carbon accounting department that may or may not sit next to the financial accounting department.
In terms of, we talk about 2050 as this target, and again, in my prior life, half the people I was speaking to would be asking me what companies are going to go up or down in the next 3 weeks, and literally didn't care what happened next year, let alone 2050. Others had a 30-year investment horizon. Are there kind of medium-term targets people are really focusing on, or is this just something that maybe not everyone cares about enough yet because it's too far away?
No, there are medium and short-term targets, and maybe I'll give you an example of a transition investment my fund would do. If we were to acquire a utility, we have annual carbon intensity reduction targets, and we just don't make them up or pick a number we like. There's an initiative called Science-Based Targets, which is a fantastic scientific framework of how to measure carbon reductions. And this framework, which I cannot really change, they will just give me a number for utilities, for example, has an annual reduction target of 3 to 4% of carbon emissions. And if we as Brookfield were to make an investment there, we need to make sure we stay very close to the Science-Based Targets framework, because otherwise, if we are looking to sell, let's say in 2030, 2032, after a 10-year hold, people would hold us accountable that these targets are not met. And similarly, I think a few years ago, big corporates, I mean, every corporate went out and said, oh, we're going to be net zero by 2050, happy days. Probably the CEO was thinking, whatever, I'm not going to be around then. But I think there has been, particularly in the US, for example, with the SEC, they have clearly said, this is a forward-looking statement, just like you would say that my EBITDA is going to reach $1 billion in 2030. So we will check in on the annual progress to make sure you're not misleading investors on what you are saying.
The same kind of rigor that has historically gone into financial accounting and financial disclosure now is starting to be applied to sustainability disclosure, largely starting with climate and carbon, but really think about it as sustainability more broadly. And that's why this is such a big deal. Putting sustainability disclosure under the same governance as financial accounting standards that are used in over 140 countries, with the oversight of the world's securities regulators. This is the biggest development in accounting standard setting in decades. And what the ISSB aims to do is create sustainability disclosure standards that are decision useful. That means decision useful for investors, cost effective for preparers, and then market informed. So market informed meaning developed using a transparent and inclusive due process. So what we're trying to do today is, just like accounting standards created that common language, use sustainability disclosure standards to create a common language between businesses and investors to talk about sustainability performance. And not just to talk about sustainability performance, but to talk about the link between sustainability performance and financial performance and the value of an entity or an asset. So this gives you an example, hotels and lodging. I think this will be pretty intuitive to most of you. Energy management, water management, ecological impacts based on where properties are sited, labor practices, climate change adaptation. Those are the disclosure topics, and then for each of those, there are suggested metrics. Probably one of the biggest risks with that transition that Mark showed from a voluntary landscape to a mandated or regulatory landscape is that organizations start to think about sustainability information as a compliance exercise, and it kind of gets put over to the side and not integrated into the core business. So really, as we go through this transition, really making sure that sustainability data is decision useful and used in both business and investor decision making through the lens of how does this connect it to risk and opportunities, I think is one of the most important thing for leadership teams to think about. With a lot of competing demands and interests for information, it is difficult for businesses to know what to report. And standards will create a level playing field where everyone discloses the same thing globally. Not the exact same information, but is disclosing to the same standards globally. So they're protective of businesses, but at the end of the day, it does come back to what is that common language and creating that common language between companies and investors to talk about sustainability performance. And that's how ultimately we can improve sustainability performance globally.
Those of you who follow the workings of the IPCC will have seen the report last week, very under-publicised, but nonetheless really quite shocking in its analysis of the progress we are making collectively around the world to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. The bad news is we are pretty likely to overshoot. And in overshooting, the band of that overshoot is really, really quite shocking. If we reach 2.3, 2.4, 2.5 degrees of global warming, that will be existential for many countries around the world. We have lost 48% of our farmland bird species in the last 40 years. We've lost 50% of our hedgerows, which are vital habitat corridors for so many species. Only 14% of England's rivers reach a base ecological standard. We've lost 50% of our earthworms, who are a key indicator of soil health, and it's soil health on which our whole food system relies. So the damage to the natural environment is so serious that some futurists will say that it's that will hasten planetary collapse before the climate crisis does, because this deeply interconnected and interrelated natural web of life, once it reaches its tipping points, we have no clue really about what the implications will be for life on Earth. In the UK, inequality is rising, and if you're poor, you are more likely to suffer from environmental impacts, from food-related, diet-related ill health, from poor air quality, from other environmental factors. And of course, if you're poor and sick, you can't work. You can't contribute to the economy. You can't contribute to your community. You rely heavily on the sorts of social and healthcare services that we are now struggling to provide. The good news is that the sector that I work in, food and farming, land use and the countryside, is not just one of the drivers of some of the issues that we're describing here, but has the capacity to solve those problems, to address those issues and to solve those problems. So whilst agriculture is a major source of GHG emissions, it also has the potential to sequester carbon through different land use practices. Changes in farming and in food production also have the potential to re-establish nature, restore biodiversity, to redevelop the habitats that nature relies on so much, and shifting what we manufacture, what we eat, how we eat it, can have dramatic impacts on our own health, our own well-being. Those of you who are sometimes feeling not as confident as you might that you're doing the right thing, you have the support to do the right thing, that will affirm for you that this is precisely what citizens want us to focus on. They want us to focus on tackling the big global issues, not just for themselves, but for their children and their grandchildren. They want governments and they want businesses to do the right thing and to visibly do the right thing.
The fundamental philosophy that's driving all of this, as we've heard, is about providing the market with information. And I think Mark encapsulated that really well earlier on. The idea is that if you give the market the information, then the market will drive the change. And that's not to say, of course, that regulatory breaches won't be sanctioned in the way that we're historically used to. So there will inevitably be fines for companies which don't comply with the regulations. But I think the primary focus here is really about data. And it's about giving the market that information that it needs to make those investment-driven decisions. Essentially what CS3D does, again this is crude, is to require larger organisations within its scope to carry out due diligence and to mitigate the impacts of ESG impacts across the entire value chain. Now this has been highly controversial. There's been lots of debates at a European level about how far this goes. Does it cover financial services, for example? But it looks like it is going to happen at some point. We don't have a definitive timeline yet. And this will have enormous impacts, I think, across the entire EU market, but also for any other businesses that aren't necessarily located in the EU, but which do significant business in the EU, which I would venture to guess is most of us in this room. So what the timeline does is it's basically it's a linear illustration of all the regulation that's happening in the UK and the EU over the next 8 or 9 years. It looks back a couple of years, and it also looks forward as well. You can effectively press buttons to go specifically to the particular areas you're interested in. So there's a UK version and an EU version, or you can look at both simultaneously. And what you can also do is click on specific buttons to make the content in relation to those buttons disappear. That will enable you, hopefully, to be able to target the particular areas that you're most interested in and leave aside the things that you don't think are of direct relevance to you.
2 warnings, 2 areas of beware. One of those is greenwashing. And again, the EU is rather ahead of us at the moment in terms of legislation in that area. But there is going to be an increasing clampdown on bad use of saying that you're good at being green and being good on the environment. There are huge abuses at the moment that have been seen, and the regulations are after you. Certainly in the UK, the Competitions and Markets Authority have already started clamping down on this. The Financial Conduct Authority has its 6 principles. The Advertising Standards Agency has already been putting out quite strong fines in terms of wrong promotion of products, and we're promised a new consumer bill which will have big fines in that area as well. The other area of beware, I'm just going to say, is offsetting. Offsetting can sometimes, in terms of carbon emissions and in fact biodiversity, that can be good on occasions, but the track record of of offsetting is of very weak schemes that are very difficult to prove that they've actually benefited anything in the long term. The obvious ones being tree planting, where yes, you plant the trees, but you forget to look after them after you've planted them. And I would just beware of those two areas.
So ultimately what we're seeing is an increasing duty to report, but we're also seeing a duty to act within the legislation. And I think it's really important for organisations to understand that, because you're all going to have to respond to it. So really this should be a holistic approach to people across the sector. And it's through this social and human capital that you are generating your financial capital. And the kinds of topics that you need to be thinking about and may well already be working on are health, safety and welfare, diversity, equity and inclusion, workforce engagement, fair labour and community engagement. So to do this, we are going to be looking to develop a means to measure impact across 4 key groups. So employees, guests, value chain workers and communities. We're going to try to ensure that the metrics that we set drive positive impact rather than negative impact, or at least enable the differentiation between the two. If you are not thinking quite carefully about how you are mapping and tracking both your social and environmental data today, then I suggest you start thinking it as soon as you leave this conference tomorrow. Mandated sustainability disclosures and social disclosures are coming, and so is assurance. So you're going to need to be sure that you have an auditable data trail that you can share with auditors who are going to be able to track the impacts that you're disclosing. So consolidate what you're doing under the S in ESG. Consider consulting stakeholders much more deeply. Set metrics to measure your performance and design systems to capture data to enable you to robustly report. This is going to make you better able to respond, more assurance ready, and ultimately it will increase your business resilience, because it's the people in your business that are making your business great.
If you are able to offer a lower risk product in the form of a higher ESG compliant hotel, logically from a banking perspective, you're supposed to be lower risk, and as a result of that, we hope at least that you are getting better terms on your credit side. And it will, I guess, in the future come to a point whereby it won't just be a question of better terms, it will be a question of whether you are getting a senior loan or you're not, right?
So we have started to notice first this year, actually, in the selling process, that we have got some questions around, the ESG area. Can we show that our properties are ESG and especially taxonomy compliant or not? And this is, of course, something we are looking at, because if we want to sell, we want to have more buyers of our properties. And this is also a very important cause of why we need to have these green properties. And if we look at when we acquire properties, I'm right now working with a transaction team in how to calculate actually what we get in, and we need to do the transition journey. Because now I just get in the properties and then I need to do the work.
I think it's worth bearing in mind the speed with which ESG has kind of risen up the agenda as well. Even a year ago, we just valued the cash flows with a little bit of, be aware of the ESG, right? But now it is really getting ingrained into the investment decision making right from up front, because of that potential obsolescence risk as that EU taxonomy just rolls out.
Data is key. If you haven't got any data, I'd say you do run the risk of having very limited options. But the other thing I would say is hotels, as a lender looking across all of the commercial real estate asset classes, hotels actually is probably the best placed. Apart from leased hotels, arguably you have access to all the data yourselves, whereas if you look at offices, retail parks, logistics, you're so reliant on the tenants to get a lot of that energy use. Actually, hotels is a really well-placed sector amongst the commercial real estate lending market to really progress forward quickly. I think what we're seeing now is that actually sustainability is pretty much embedded in every lender's decision-making process. So what you're probably seeing is a polarization of where lenders are focusing. Those lenders with bank capital or institutional capital are very much looking for compliant assets today. And those lenders where, which is, I guess, akin to an Article 9 type investment, those lenders that have more varied sources of capital are probably looking for more Article 8 type investments where, you can really, with some input, you can really develop the asset and make it compliant over time.
Yes, at Accor Invest, we committed to setting science-based targets. It's something that is not easy because the first step is to commit, which we've done. Second is to develop targets, which we've done, and it's easy as well, I would say, because we just have to get into the 1.5 trajectory and stay in the reduction 4.2. So this is easy, but the challenging part is how do we reach these targets? And before submitting the targets, we need to have a robust plan in place that we prove that we can reach them.
Maybe just one word as well from our own experience, just to add, because it's great, obviously, if you have a BMS system, but let's be honest, there's a whole world of hotels out there that are older than 20 years that don't have the latest Schneider BMS inside. So the big question is how we're dealing with this. And I think it's really fascinating. If you just take a step aside, so I was in Mippen 2 weeks ago, and actually met up with a quite young company, and what they're doing is they're helping to put in as an afterthought, basically, small sensors across the estate, across the hotel, at a fraction of the cost that your BMS or Schneider BMS system would cost you. So now again, at least what that allows you is to get the data and at least to know what the problems are. What it doesn't obviously allow you is to be reactive, what the BMS system. But what I'm saying is things that about 2 years ago would have been impossible to do. There's a lot of new tech out there, and it's just everybody should really, whenever you go to these conferences, spend time with the venture companies, right? Spend a bit of time there. They're coming out with fascinating solutions that really can help us all to even make the older assets that effectively represent the majority of hotels, quite often, at least in a number of countries, right? Particularly in Europe, how to get them up to specs, even if you do not have a built-in BMS system, and even if the actual capex would not, because of the performance of the hotel or whatever, it wouldn't allow you to put it in place. But there are other alternative solutions out there, and so that's what we're using as well whenever we reconvert some of the assets.
The brands need to do a bit more in being able to get customers to understand why they should pay a premium for assets that are more sustainable and on a pathway than ones that aren't on that journey.
I think for them, the skill perspective, I think is super important when we talk backhouse, because today, often the people that should manage these nice BMS systems that we want to put in or we want to track data, they don't even know how to handle it. Maybe it's someone from the receptionist that ended up like a guy going around in the building. And also the salary issues here, because we are really pushing this in our own operation. It's only 20 hotels, but we continuously need to educate. And then they are maybe quitting, we need to start again. So it's an ongoing education all the time, because it's becoming more technical, and to have smart properties, you need to have the right people backhouse.
There is obviously a bit of a conflict of interest. I mean, which brand owner is going to let go of 30% of their existing portfolio because they're not up to Article 8, right? It's not going to happen tomorrow. But I think it's a step-by-step process, and I think if you happen to be the owner's representative and the operator, which we are, you can achieve quite a bit because you can also incentivize the operations accordingly, right? So in our case, we have annual ESG audits that are being run, and our GM, a percentage of that bonus is a reflection of the outcome of those ESG audits. So there are ways of how to get there, but it needs a lot of proactive management because of otherwise there are conflicts of interest out there.
Customers will pay more to stay in a hotel that is aligned with their social values.
Have you seen that happen?
Yeah, so the One Hotels, so the CEO of SH Group is also the CEO of Stark Capital, but we're not the same business. But we own some of those hotels, and the way that we see those perform is better than we expected, and they're outperforming their comp sets because people feel a connection with that brand and will pay up for that. And so there's not just, there's a massive opportunity there for kind of all hotel owners and asset owners and the brands as well, if they can connect with their customers.
This is very, very interesting to hear, because this topic comes up a lot, are we going to get a premium for hotels? Because in offices, corporate-led, occupier-led, they have their own targets and they're willing to pay more rent. The institutions are paying sharper yields. But on the operational side of things in hotels, you can argue that your OPEX will be lower. The top line is a bit more challenging, particularly in this environment. So it's good to hear that we are starting to see that, particularly in certain segments.
If I look at what matters to our investors, clearly the first thing is returns, right? But after that, they're big institutions. So often big pension funds, their ESG requirements are immense. I mean, really, really are. And in terms of the investment we need to make into buildings, a whole load of that is to do with ESG. And to not have it in the operational agreement is, I think is wrong, actually.
Kempinski started its sustainability journey a long time ago, and has looked at it on various aspects from the environmental, the social, and the governance. And we've always had a strong focus on valuing traditions and local communities. But it's never really been a big sort of PR exercise for us, although as ESG has evolved and standards have evolved, we too have evolved in our strategy. And so a few years ago, we adopted the UN Global Compact Sustainable Development Goals, and we made a public statement about that as is required, and we've signed up to several other commitments, and also on human rights, on diversity and inclusion. And since then, what we did a year and a half ago when I took over managing that aspect is that we put together a sustainability committee, and that committee oversees the various areas of ESG, and we have C-suite members, department heads, and subject matter specialists covering the environmental, the social, and the governance in various areas of the operations of the business. And that committee is divided into subcommittees for the E, the S, and the G. And last year we published our first ESG report on TCFD standards.
Chris, do you think it's possible in the context of an HMA to fully align the ESG related interests of all the different layers of parties that you see? So owner, branded operator, lender, white label operator. Do you think it's too ambitious at the moment to expect that the interests of all those different parties can be aligned?
I think it probably is potentially too early, because I don't think all the issues have even been identified yet, still less addressed. So I think we're down to reasonableness in many hotel management agreements, and certainly as far as the S part is concerned, decency, where it's not addressed by law. So I think it does take a lot of goodwill on the part of the various interested parties to come up with something in a management agreement. But increasingly, people are willing to sit down and talk about it in our experience. And I think one of the reasons for that on the ownership side, which is where many of the costs are incurred, of course, is looking forward towards exit. And yes, some of the owners may be, long-term 15, 20, 30-year ownership horizon investors. Others may want to be out in 5 years, and they're looking forward saying, if I'm fully compliant in 5 years' time, that's going to increase the audience for this potential asset sale. So I think there are lots of overlaying, interrelated aspects of this that need to be considered. But overall, I think I'm seeing, people being reasonable about inclusion of ESG matters in a management agreement.
One thing very important, nobody is being pushed into any of the lease or HMA without knowing ins and outs of any particular building or the building that is going to be built. So therefore, I think common sense is that, especially if you're doing a development lease, which I have done, and we have few of them, is that you sit around with the landlord, developer, and the tenant. So, okay, we want to reach to this BREEAM excellent or whatever level we want to do it. We want to have BREEAM in operation when the hotel opens. So let's draw this, how it's going to look like. And then you're looking at your market and you know your business case for that particular hotel and you know how much you can pay. So everyone takes a bit of a hit. So there is not just a landlord, but there's a developer. And if it's an existing building you're taking over, then you know all the usages, you know all the issues. So you talk around it. It's not just putting one cost to just the operator or just the owner. I think everybody's just now talking around this and finding an amicable solution.
And I think it's a different situation, obviously, when you're dealing with a new build, where you can put in lots of provisions as to the standards that the hotel will have to achieve, than when you'll say retrofitting or refurbishment an old house, say in Chelsea, Chris, which is something that we're involved in. I mean, it's a totally different picture.
As a manager, the only asset we have is the people, right? So that's just start with that. So it's not me or Janet who's cleaning or running the hotels, it's those people. So for us, the people comes first. I know everybody says that, but how much effort you put behind this, is the real, importance about, again, it's the diversity, there's inclusion, is the fair wages, equal wages, it goes across, and if you imagine that we have hotels we're managing in Budapest to Prague to Barcelona to Dundee, with the jurisdictions we deal with, the type of cultures we deal with, and everything. And if we can't get that right, it just becomes, it will affect, in fact, the whole company. So we really sort of, as the ExCom, and we all responsible of the ESG, and in every sort of ExCom meeting, monthly or bi-monthly, this is a subject we focus on, and especially every 3 months we have a whole day session around people that Janet leads, and it's all about this. It's all about where we stand for our team members, what are we doing it and in different jurisdictions, and what can we do better for them, and that's really important for us.
Increasingly, they're sort of living, breathing documents that do need to be referred to and that may need to be modified, as we've discussed every year with the budget process. So that strict, sort of this is the management agreement, read it and weep was one of the expressions that used to be bandied about in my day, thing of the past.
David?
I think about partnership in terms of how everybody works together. And then the tip on the building is the building management system. I said that before.
So partnership, collaboration.
Yeah, it has to be, otherwise it won't work.
As someone said earlier, we're custodians of buildings for a relatively brief time. And I was pleased to hear someone say we should be handing them on in better condition. That's, I think, what ESG at its heart is really trying to achieve for us in the buildings and infrastructure sector. But of course it has to be measurable and impactful. Investors want to put their money into the right projects and have that certainty, but increasingly concerned about greenwash. So a benchmark like BREEAM, I can assure you, is rigorous and will remain so. We know that it gives confidence to investors and shareholders, and hopefully will increasingly be a key indicator of certainty when you're raising funds. We have seen, in fact, some beneficial financial uplift from BREEAM ratings, particularly in the London commercial office market asset yields. So it looks like we're heading into a new world now, where people who don't take the opportunity to upgrade will now see them lose value. Not only will they not get the uplift, they will lose value quite quickly. I think BREEAM has a lot to offer and is in fact perfect as a rating for hospitality, partly because of the holistic nature that I talked about earlier. Some of the more single metric schemes have their place, and we actually do recognise them within BREEAM credits. But we think that we can help you to appeal to your dual or multiple audience, in fact, of investors and guests, and your employees, and increasingly authorities and regulators. So, for example, key metrics like energy use and water use, vital for managers, and reducing those can lead to significant cost savings, but they aren't necessarily seen by your customers. Whereas metrics like health and well-being, which, as I say, is included, and land use and ecology, also included in BREEAM, are more visible to guests and can enhance their stays and their experience of staying in your properties. For the first time, we've worked with industry working groups to ensure that BREEAM in use really reflects the needs of your sector. And BREEAM, we think, is even more perfect now for reflecting the different locations you operate in and the different types of buildings. So I'm delighted to note that just last week, the latest version that we've released of the BREEAM online platform introduces a number of questions specific to the hotel industry, which will allow much more detailed analysis and enable us to produce data for you collectively and individually. These include adding 14 different subtypes to the hotel drop-down options and new questions on occupancy and non-standard energy uses. We've used the STR definitions widely used in the sector to hope to get as much alignment as we can with what you're already doing. So this means we'll be able to compare your performance to similar types of hotel, luxury to luxury, economy to economy, and so on. And you'll also be able to align BREEAM data to other data such as room rates in the STR database, hopefully making a much more powerful set of information for you.
It's not just about regulation. In a way, you could argue the real fuel for this are Janine's accounting standards, wherever she's gone.
Yes.
But that's going to be the reason why you collect this data, some of which you report, some of which you don't, but that's how you make decisions in your business. That's how you get new insights, new KPIs, new wonderful services for your customers. It's a lot of it is linked to that. It's not just regulation and tick the box and whatever, or not tick the box. Right? It's very important, this interlinkage. And all the governments have said, we will adopt Janine standards. I'm calling them Janine standards. We should call them JS now. But it's a really important point. Don't get distracted by regulation only, because it isn't just about regulation.
If the people act now to secure that capacity, they're going to be the ones in the driver's seat in 4, 5, 6 years' time, when everybody else is forced by regulation to get hold of this capacity. So, last piece of consumer advice. If I were you, check it out, have a look. Do you have the right capacity for EV charging points? Do you have the right capacity for your heat pump? And if you don't, try and secure it now.
The key thing is, I think for all our customers, and the key message that we deliver across is that it's kind of two things. It's two structures to what we do. We help our customers decarbonise their business, and we help them optimise their energy operations. And that's really key for us.
We have a unique opportunity to take decisions and actions that can protect the planet on which we live and we enjoy. What bigger calling could we ask for? We have a human responsibility to take the necessary actions to address this crisis. And as leaders, our time is now. So I urge you to keep raising your bar, fighting this crisis head on for the future of our planet and the future of our families.
When we look at what's been happening over the past decades, we can see a lot of exponential growth. So the exponential growth in the world population, the amount of CO2 that we emit into the world, the amount of fresh water that we consume, the ecotoxicity going through the roof. And as we all have learned during the COVID crisis, exponential growth in a closed-off system never leads to a well end. And as the Earth is also a closed system with finite resources, we need to understand that this closed system with these exponential growth can really quickly lead to tipping points. And this tipping point, what we mean is that it's very possible that we cross the planetary boundary that is needed to facilitate our life and our way of living on this Earth by focusing on this exponential consumption, really, that we're talking about here. Many of the issues I've shown you today are directly related to the linear economy. So the linear economy is the economy we're in now, where we take resources from our Earth, we make something with it, and then we waste it. And you can imagine that all these steps in the process require both resources, but also energy, and have a certain environmental impact on our world. And this can be a very broad, diverse range of impact, because all these impacts push the planetary boundaries. This planetary boundaries is a model which is developed by the Stockholm Resiliency Center, which really looks at the 9 sort of parameters which are needed to make sure that our planet is in balance. I'm going to briefly explain to you how this model works. So you have in the middle the green zone, which is where we are in the safe zone, really, where the planet can balance itself out. Then there's the orange zone, where there are some changes happening, but we are still good to go. We can reverse it. And then the red zone is where we really have transgressed these planetary boundaries. And when we talk about sustainability, we almost always talk about carbon, the emission of carbon, which is very important, of course. But when we look at the climate change piece of the pie, we can see we're still in the orange zone, and the 1.5 degrees from the Paris Climate Accord would be the tipping point where we will see really big changes in the way our planet functions. At the same time, we can see there's 8 other planetary boundaries, some which are still in the good. So there are some freshwater use, which is kind of good. There's ozone depletion, which is still doing okay. But then when we look, for instance, at biosphere integrity, we can see that there's really a big problem. We are transgressing the planetary boundaries. Too much of the species on these planets are dying out, which will make it very hard for this planet to live in a structural manner. We need to build a better and different future. And one of the ways to look at it is really to understand that our current economy, the linear economy, is not using the resources in the right way. We need to focus on a circular economy. Another thing that's really important in a circular economy is the perception of value. So we have financial value, which is of course very productive, very important for our everyday businesses, but at the same time we also need to think about ecological value. So in this model on the left you can see what we call the value hill. And when we have a process in which we produce a product, on the left, in every step value is added. So we extract resources, we manufacture something, we assemble something, we sell it, and then the user uses it at the height of the value hill. And then once the user no longer needs it, we throw it into the bin and it goes directly to the landfill, and all this value is being destroyed. In a circular economy, we can still use resources. So again, we add a lot of value. The first step is really extending the lifespan of the product, so to make sure that the user uses it as long as possible. And then we have these R strategies, as we call them. So the first is to reuse. And as you can see, this first arrow actually makes sure that the value of the product is retained at its highest level. Then you can refurbish, which means that some changes need to be made, and then you can resell it, again keeping it much higher on this value base. And this is, for a financial point of view, very important, because right now using renewable or new resources is not very expensive. In the future it will be. At the same time, there's also a lot of ecological value saved, which really significantly reduces our environmental impact on the planet. How to apply this in your work? I realize that there are many different stakeholders here before me with different types of organizations, but what I do think is very important is to really understand the impact that you have from a broad perspective. And I've heard a lot of good things about SBTIs, about scope 1, 2, and 3, but really try to understand this impact in a very broad range of environmental impact. Define concrete and measurable goals. So where do you want to go? Trial small-scale innovations, but then do scale them up if they are a success, and maybe above all, share this knowledge that you have to make sure that it's not just your organization who is scaling towards this sustainable economy, but that the whole system is.
Create the baseline, create the roadmap, and then see where your destination actually is and track against that.
At IHG, we have Journey to Tomorrow, which is our responsible business plan to 2030, and that covers people, communities, and planet. So within that, on the planet side, the really big task for us is our science-based target. So we have a 1.5 degree aligned target, which will mean halving our emissions regardless of growth to 2030, which is really massive for us. IHG, we have over 6,000 hotels across 100 countries globally, with a further 1,800 in the pipeline, and it's pretty much all franchise or managed, so it's other people's money. So we are trying to work very closely, obviously, with those partners to enact change.
I think the key thing is buy-in, like really, obviously from a management level, C-suite, but like working with the hotels, the assets themselves, the brands. We're getting a lot of pressure from guests, from corporates asking us about our own sustainability strategy, but really working with the different departments each department would need to get to if we wanted to achieve net zero, and working with them, making sure that they understand the journey themselves, and making it pertinent to their department. We're switching providers because they're not able to provide those measures, those values that we need to start creating a baseline for. And then hopefully the next journey is tracking our progress. So we have now an action plan that we'll be sharing with the group. It's tailored per asset. So as Catherine mentioned, we have a few IHG hotels. We have the Marriott, we have the Hilton Canopy. So each one has a different market, a different asset. And so we need to make sure that they're able to hit their own targets that we've set.
Nobody wants their assets to be stranded at the end of the day. That's one of the worst situations you can possibly get yourself into. But obviously, you need to just keep investing. It's all about reinvesting, changing the style of your hotel, the brands itself, and the change in the brand specifications, adhering to that, and working with the market. Obviously, at the end of the day, there are, however, costs involved in doing that, and that's ongoing. It's also one thing that what we need to do is actually reduce our carbon footprint, full stop. We've all been talking about it today. It's been the topic of conversation, and the one way that we can do it as hoteliers certainly is actually reducing our energy bills.
The crux of TCFD is to determine what is the cost to achieve net zero carbon and what is the cost to ensure that we're resilient in the future. So all of the analysis we do, the CREM analysis, the climate risk, is to determine to what extent our investments need to step in, need to lean in, and need to understand what the costs are to take us to 2050. And can we unlock value doing that? So I just wanted to pick up on a point that's been mentioned throughout the day, but also just now on the panel, which is about collaboration. It is so important that we unlock all of the ways of working we've had in the past, and we don't assume that everyone understands everyone else's perspectives, that we just ask the questions and we make sure that people are aware of what the ambitions are throughout the sector. I mean, sure, it wasn't there's no cookie cutter available now. It is problem solving, and we have to collaborate to be able to achieve that. Back to the question, did we unlock any value? What we found was yes, we did, because this hotel has been able to secure a far greater rate of corporate clientele who are aligning with their own corporate strategy. And this has given us a much more stable return. And simply this comes from being open, having discussions, being collaborative, being clear, as well as being ambitious, because some of these targets that are being set, they are very ambitious, and we're going to have to work together to achieve that.
According to research that we undertook, 80% of finance companies have said that they would stop funding the real estate sector if it didn't adequately address the transition to a sustainable economy. And then one of the things we're always asked when we start talking about this is, well, what about the cost? Sustainable construction doesn't always mean increased cost. So if you reduce your waste materials on site, you reduce the energy and water use on site, if you include second-hand materials, we've heard about the circular economy, that actually can help save costs. So it's essentially increased capex for decreased opex. And that scenario creates some difficulties because it isn't always the same party that's suffering that increased cost that benefits from the decreased cost. And we have to look at ways in which we can innovatively make sure that that is transferred to the right people or shared between the right people. So what does our sustainable hotel construction paper seek to do? Well, firstly, it discusses some of the reasons why it's so important for the construction sector and the hotel sector to focus on sustainability. And the paper then goes on to provide 9 model clauses that can be used in the construction contracts in the hotel sector to promote sustainable construction. So clearly there is a balancing act between aiming for the ideal and the aspirational and producing clauses that are going to be practically adoptable. And as David Tarsh mentioned, that those that are commercially viable, and that's a key requirement for the EEA.
I should firstly say that these clauses haven't been drafted in a vacuum. They are based on clauses produced by the Chancery Lane Project. For those who are unaware, the Chancery Lane Project is a collaborative effort of over 2,500 lawyers from around the world working to develop new contract clauses and model laws to help combat the effects of climate change. We have taken the clauses most appropriate for use in the hotel development context and hotelicize these where necessary. So they cover a number of issues. There is some crossover between the clauses, and it isn't therefore intended that all 9 of them will be used in a single contract, but rather for all to be considered and then the most appropriate selected depending on your development, so a sort of pick and mix approach. And so going on to the clauses themselves, they promote sustainability in a number of ways, including firstly obliging contractors to adopt energy efficiency and environmental considerations, so akin to the standard provision you see in construction contracts dealing with modern slavery or anti-bribery compliance. Incentivizing contractors to come up with modifications that will make the development greener and provide them with a bonus for doing so. Promoting biodiversity in the landscaping of developments. Dealing with sustainable procurement of construction materials, which is a clause that I helped lead the drafting on. Dealing with construction waste management and the minimisation of waste and landfill. Promoting sustainable practices and net zero aligned provisions in modular build contracts. Promoting energy savings or other positive environmental impacts throughout the build phase. And finally, promoting the use of supply chain questionnaires to enable key stakeholders to understand the required approach to climate change initiatives.
The Global Youth Awards were also started by Tiffany back in 2012. We celebrated 10 years last year of celebrating young people. And what we provide is a global platform for young people to showcase their projects that they do in 3 areas: environmental rejuvenation, educational innovation, and empowering everyone. And Beyond Bamboo support we sponsor the environmental category for the Global Youth Awards. And as I said on stage here, I've got our winners and contributors to the Global Youth Awards.
There has to be a ceiling to the modern world. Like, we can't grow and grow and grow. It's like with the plastic, we talked about plastic bags, you know, cool, create cotton bags or jute bags, but it's like, well, actually, if you're going to reuse that plastic bag over and over and over again for 10, 20 years, that's going to be more environmentally sustainable than the jute bags. So it's not a case of, oh, this is bad, make something else. I think it's like, if we've already got something in the system, how can we reuse that and recycle that to continue that process? Like, the plastic and the oils that we've already made are still there. If we can just have the technology and the wisdom and the wants to think outside of the box, then we can use what we've got. Like, there is enough to go around. And I think also, being that outdoorsy person here, I think it is, dare I say it, thinking outside of the money box. And I think it's like, actually, where can we as an industry make some sacrifices? Because we can't keep moving forwards. We're not on the same train track. We have to jump onto another one. We've got to think outside of the boxes that we've grown up working in and living in, because like, this isn't the future. We're in the present. The future is different to now, so it has to look different. We have to think different. We have to challenge ourselves. We have to talk with people that contradict us and explore that.
Being honest and being realistic about what your plans are as being part of the hospitality sector is just, you can't just say, you plan to be net zero waste at year whatever and just hope for the best. You have to have a sustainability strategy and actually know what you're going to do, and as a hotel, understand what that entails and what that actually means.
Yeah, well, the hard truth is that the companies you work for do profit off modern slavery, and that's just a fact. And it's a hard truth, and it's an uncomfortable truth. But I encourage you to sit in that discomfort, to really feel it, because that means that it will sort of push you to take action, or push you to learn, to grow, to unlearn even, and to change your business practices and models. You know, under the Modern Slavery Act 2015, companies earning over £36 million are supposed to produce modern slavery statement. The Walk Free Foundation, along with WikiRate, produced a report a couple of years ago on compliance and sort of action against modern slavery in the hotel industry. And sort of at the end of it, there's an annex of all of the modern slavery statements produced by hotels. To be quite frank, most of them are quite pathetic. The legislation itself is very toothless. It's essentially a document that, you know, companies, and it might be some of your companies, produce to say, we acknowledge that there's modern slavery in our supply chain, and that's about it. You know, you're not required to take any action. There's no accountability. There's no enforcement. So really, the legislation is not there, and this is something that we're pushing for. You know, as youth, we're pushing for this in the sector, but generally the whole mainstream sector is really pushing for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence laws. We're not here to make your life harder. We are here to, you know, really humanize the issue.
Our aim with this course, which we are launching, I guess, today, Ufi, are we? Yes. Okay. Is to basically, as you can read there, is to forge a network of collaboration, essentially, in your industry around the world to get us unlearning, being ambitious, making mistakes, learning from each other. It's that simple, really. I mean, that's all we're really trying to do. Ultimately, we are hoping also to involve the operational management side of it in an extension of this probably sometime next year, but more news on that later. The first thing is to get the leaders in this room to do the course, and they are saying this is happening. So we need to understand the real bedrock of this. It's a bit depressing, but we have to do it. But then we can quickly get on to, okay, so the opportunities and the growth, and we'll do a whole session around that. You see here 5 of these are essentially, or 3 or 4 of them, whatever it is, are essentially online. We also do some in-person stuff, and there will be a project and therefore certification at the end of this. And then, yes, lastly, this crucial area around resilience leadership and action planning, and how do I keep essentially a body of people happy with the idea that the only change is really constant change, because things are going to keep changing faster and faster and faster. So that's a very different management challenge. So that's something we need to think about. And then, as I say, we'll bring it all together in some kind of project yet to be determined. Okay, ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, look, there's a spectrum here. I think we've laid it out pretty well today. We can all either reject all this and say, you know what, I'm really not interested, and that's fine. I mean, that's a point of view. Or we can go, well, I'm resisting, but I'm dragged along. I get it. I'm going to have to do this. Or I can go, well, I'm still not sure, but actually, on balance, I can see maybe it's quite a good thing. Or actually, I'm getting quite excited because there are amazing opportunities here. It's arguably the biggest new business opportunity the world's ever seen, to reinvent everything. It's fantastic. So our aim is to say, somehow you've got to decide where you want to sit on this spectrum as individuals, as leaders. And you can either be on the compliance side, because you're going to have to do that, or you can be on the entrepreneurship side. And I hope it's clear what we will be trying to push you towards on this course, but obviously it's up to you.